Welcome to the Fight for Rights Lecture 1. This is a short recap of the main points in the lecture. That it's not meant to replace the lecture, you still need to attend it so that you can ask questions and interact and get the full picture, but this is for your revision purposes, the key points. So we're starting with the 60th anniversary of the publication of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by the United Nations. And there's quite a lot of anniversaries going on at the moment to commemorate that. But where does that idea of human rights come from? We've got different types of rights that are enshrined in this declaration and in further legislation passed by other governments. So they do include democratic rights, political rights. They also include legal rights, the right to life, and mobility rights, the freedom of movement. And you can characterize them in different categories. So there are economic, social, and cultural rights. There's rights according to people's status, so whether they're workers, whether they're women, whether they're Aboriginal peoples, for example. There's rights to do with actions in war and rights about whether you're a citizen in war or a soldier, and rights of self-determination by minority groups. But as we'll see in this lecture, there's a paradox, and it's one that Lynn Hunt talks about in the set reading for the next couple of weeks, which is that we assume that human rights are eternal and universal, an essential part of human nature, but in fact, the notion of human rights has a distinct history. It appears and disappears at particular periods of history, and the way in which it's formulated is very much dependent on the historical circumstances of particular nations at particular moments in time. So it's not a universal truth. It's not a concept that has existed forever. It's actually quite a recent concept and has only really been truly enshrined in legislation and law since 1948. So there are other types of rights that aren't to do with human rights, such as divine right and property rights, which determine who governs, who has the right of representation, who has a say in what laws are passed. And it's only, in the Western sense, it's only since the 17th century in the Enlightenment that we've seen new ideas about what they call natural rights emerging. So we'll go through these classic texts about the idea of natural rights. But all of these people, these white Western Europeans, natural rights are still not defined. They're not the same as human rights. They don't actually specify, a lot of them, what rights people should have. There is another argument, again put forward by Lynn Hunt, that human rights are developed in the late 18th century debates over punishment, how you should punish criminals and whether you should execute them or not. And there's an increasing humanitarian impulse, particularly amongst evangelical religion, that we should move towards morally reforming prisoners rather than brutally punishing them. And the religious and humanitarian movements also can be seen in the anti-slavery campaigns that emerge in the late 18th century. And we'll study anti-slavery in a later week. But again, there's a question here about how much is the anti-slavery movement about human rights? What is motivating them? Should we be applying our 21st century ideas about human rights to what the people campaigning against the slave trade were actually thinking? And especially important is that this is an age of revolution. This is a time of great change, and that's why we're starting the module in the 1790s, is that these new ideas are coming from revolutionary forces, mainly from America and France, who revolt against monarchical power, set up their own governments, their own states, um, and are opposing the divine right and to some extent the rights of property to have full political participation. Um, and this inspires revolutions elsewhere, and we'll look at this in week two about the growth of new nations that are inspired by new ideas. But again, the term human rights isn't used at the time. They use the term liberty and equality and fraternity, the three key pillars of the French Revolution. But that's not the same as human rights. We'll see these two writers quite a lot over the next few weeks. Thomas Paine and his book The Rights of Man, and Mary Wollstonecraft, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. And they formulate new ideas about the rights of individuals that aren't based on history, that aren't based on precedent and legal rights, but actually are to do with being equal through natural rights. Again, they're drawing from those Enlightenment discourses, but actually making them a lot more straightforward and easy to understand by ordinary people. But we've got to still be mindful again of anachronism, that the 19th century rights of man are still not human rights. They exclude categories of people like slaves, people who didn't own property, women, religious minorities. They're not universal. They're based on rationality and autonomy. Still property still makes a big part of that definition. So we see political rights movements in the 19th century. We'll look at those in week three. In Britain, we've got, for example, Chartism, which is the big movement for the vote for all men. We see women's suffrage movements in the later 19th century across the world. We see movements for religious rights, for example, the rights for Catholics in Ireland, and labour rights for men and women who are feeling exploited because of industrialization. And again, these are different sorts of rights which are related to human rights but are not universal as well. They're still specific interests. And it takes until the early 20th century for many of these groups to have their aims achieved. And so we actually only see really the history of human rights emerging with the Second World War. In the early part of the 20th century, before and after the First World War, the big nations are still consumed with imperialism and colonialism, which again completely disregards a universalist definition of human rights, because you're subjecting indigenous peoples in your colonial powers to your rule and not allowing them full rights. So it's very difficult for the imperial powers to talk about human rights or even conceive of them when they are colonial rulers. And it's only really with the horrors of the genocides of the Second World War that the big nations think again about implementing ideas about human rights into a much more formal framework, which is the UN. So the UN is formed after conferences that held in the latter years of the Second World War in spring 1945. We have 46 nations signing the UN Charter as founding members in June 1945. But the UN Declaration of Human Rights is a specific product of history, of the impact of the Second World War and the genocides. You wouldn't have seen this formulation earlier on in history, certainly not in the League of Nations. And even then, the idea of human rights is contested. Both Great Britain and the Soviet Union rejected proposals to include human rights in the original charter. And it's only from different parts of the world, principally small and medium countries in Latin America and Asia, and voluntary and civic organizations, the sort of extra movements in the US that lobby the UN delegates for including human rights and thinking about it. Um, so the original charter of the UN of 1945 only includes a few lines about human rights, but it did set up the Human Rights Commission, which drafted the final Bill of Human Rights, and Eleanor Roosevelt played a central role as head of the commission in drafting it and getting it passed, but it's not approved until 1948. So, as Lynn Hunt argues, at a time of hardening lines of conflict in the Cold War, the Universal Declaration expressed a set of aspirations rather than a readily attainable reality. And some of those human rights are still being fought for. So we still see movements that have their origins in the 1960s, for example, the Black Rights Movement, the Gay Rights Movement, still campaigning across the world for the achievement of their own aims. So we have actually a very small window of historical time to think about this universalist definition of human rights, and most of the period that we'll be looking at is a one of reaction, and in ways that history goes backwards as well as forwards.